This is a video tutorial for Phil 123 Module 6 on conceptions of personal identity, or if you like, on accounts of personal identity. Now, there's going to be three different questions that we're going to be especially interested in this particular module. The first question is, what is it to be a person? The second question is, what is it to be the same person over time? The third question is it possible to survive the death of the physical body? I want to consider three different conceptions, three different accounts of persons and personal identity. And these are the three conceptions and accounts that really emerge in John Perry's dialogues concerning personal identity and immortality. They're also going to correspond nicely to some of the other readings and the historical figures relevant to the discussion of personal identity in the textbook. Now, the first of these particular conceptions of persons and personal identity is what we'll call a soul-based conception or a soul-based account. According to this account, to be a person is just to have a non-physical soul. That's what it is to be a person. That's what distinguishes plausible examples of persons like you and I from non-persons, things like tables and chairs and lamps and coffee cups and other such things. Whether you think animals, non-human animals that is, have souls or not, I'll leave to you to decide. But the point on this particular conception is that's what it is to be a person, to have that kind of thing, to have a soul. What is it to be the same person over time? What is it to be the same person now that you were when you were, say, 10 years old or when you were an infant? What is it to be the same person later on in your life? What is it to say that you will be the same person when you're older? On these accounts, to answer that second question, the answer is simply to have the same soul over time. That's what personal identity consists in. Personal identity consists in sameness of soul. Now, our best example of someone who goes in for a soul-based account of personal identity is the philosopher René Descartes. And I'll have more to say about Descartes in another video tutorial for this particular module because Descartes is so interesting. But if you notice from the handout, I do have a quote that's on there. Descartes imagines, he engages in a kind of thought experiment, and he thinks he can imagine, that is, conceive of, being in a place very different from this place, and having absolutely no body whatsoever. Indeed, the physical world might now no longer exist. Descartes thinks that he can imagine himself existing, thinking, persisting, even though there's nothing physical going on. And if you think, as we suggested in another video tutorial for this module, that if something's conceivable, then it's logically possible, then for someone like Descartes, surviving the death of the physical body is possible. Why? Because it's conceivable. But more importantly, you see what a soul-based account of personal identity consists in. Since Descartes thinks he, the person that is, the person Descartes, can survive without his physical body, that means a person, on this particular account, is nothing physical. You are not your body. You are not your brain. You are this non-physical soul. Now, we'll have to say a little bit about soul stuff, and again, I'll talk more about Descartes and what I'll call Cartesian dualism in another video tutorial for this particular module. But again, importantly, for someone like Descartes and for someone who goes in for a soul-based account of personal identity, whatever else a soul is, it's not a physical thing. It's not a physical thing, and that's why you can survive the death of your physical body. Contrast soul-based accounts of personal identity with what we'll call psychological-based accounts of personal identity. And this is the second account of personal identity worth talking about. Here, our best example of someone who goes in for the psychological account is the philosopher John Locke. And I'll talk about Locke in just a second here. To be a person, to answer the first question, what is it to be a person on this particular account? The answer is something like continuity of psychological states. For someone like Locke, to be the same person over time is just to have enough of the same memories over time. So, for example, Locke imagines that the soul of a prince leaves the body of the prince and switches with the soul of a cobbler, which has left the body of the cobbler. So we're imagining kind of a soul transplant here. The soul of the prince goes into the body of the cobbler, and vice versa. Locke thinks it's just obvious that the prince is now in the cobbler's body and the cobbler is now in the prince's body. Why? Because the individual inside the cobbler's body, if you like, the guy that we point to when we point to the cobbler, now has all of the prince's memories, or at least has enough of the prince's memories, and that's what makes him the same person. Not sameness of soul, but something like psychological continuity. Note I said psychological continuity and not psychological identity here. Pretty clearly, from moment to moment, from day to day, we don't have exactly the same thoughts. We change our minds, we come to have some new beliefs, we come to shed some old beliefs. We never have exactly the same thoughts from moment to moment. So personal identity on this second account does not require exact sameness of psychological states. It only requires continuity. It requires having enough of the same psychological states from moment to moment. Think about the threads of a rope. There's no one thread that goes through the entire rope. There's a bunch of overlapping threads. And if there's enough of those threads from moment to moment, then we can talk about the person being the same. It's interesting to think about cases like Alzheimer's here, or cases of severe mental trauma where a person loses their memory. On this kind of account, we might say, if someone has lost a significant portion or maybe all of their memories, that they're not the same person anymore, precisely because that psychological continuity is simply not there. This is part of the reason that diseases like Alzheimer's disease are so very tragic for a lot of people. For a lot of people, Alzheimer's really is kind of equivalent to death. If you have a family member suffering from Alzheimer's, you might react by thinking, you know what, that person is just gone. This is why it's such a tragic and difficult disorder. Okay. A third kind of a conception of personal identity then. Oh, sorry, let me answer all these questions. So for psychological accounts of personal identity, first of all, what is it to be a person? It's to be the kind of critter that can have certain psychological states. Memories in particular, but thoughts, feelings, beliefs, intentions, all the stuff that makes our mental life so rich. What is it to be the same person over time? Well, for Locke, it's to have enough memories from moment to moment. But on a psychological account, more generally, to be the same person over time is just to have psychological continuity. If you have enough of the same psychological states from moment to moment, from day to day, then we can say that you're the same person. If not, then not. Is it possible to survive the death of the physical body on this conception? A lot depends on whether or not you think thoughts can persist with the death of the physical body. We know an awful lot, not everything, but we know an awful lot about neurobiology to think that there's some sort of relationship between memory on the one hand, psychological states generally on the other, and the brain on still the other hand. There's lots of interesting cases here in which trauma to the brain creates difficulties for people's memories, for their personality, for their psychological picture overall. If you think that your psychological states are just a function of your brain, then when the body dies, it looks like your capacity for thought goes too. On the other hand, if you're someone like Descartes and think that your soul does the thinking, again, we'll talk about Descartes in another tutorial, well, then it's not so clear what to say anymore. So for psychological accounts of personal identity, surviving the death of the physical body depends a lot on what you think the nature of our psychological life is. If it's exhausted by stuff happening in your brain, then surviving death doesn't look so possible. If not, then maybe so. Now, the third conception of personal identity, the third account, is what we'll call a body-based account. Here to be a person is just to have a particular kind of physical body. Okay? Maybe like the kind of body you and I have, but maybe something very different as well. Sameness of person, then, consists in continuity of that body. Here, too, we can't talk about sameness of body over time because our bodies are constantly changing. We're shedding cells, we're regenerating cells. My understanding is that every 7 years, from 1 year to 7 years later, your body has completely regenerated all of its cells except your brain matter, which is kind of interesting. Think about your car here, right? Even if you have parts in your car replaced, we might still talk about it being the same car. It's yours and not someone else's. Our bodies might be like that as well. Even if parts are taken out, even if we lose parts, if you have your foot amputated, you might still be the same person. That's okay. Personal identity on this particular count requires sameness of body. All that means is continuity of body. Now, is surviving the death of the physical body possible on this account? Probably not. If you're just your body and your body dies, well, then you die as well.